What comes to mind when you think of Henry VIII's children? Mary, the infamous cold-blooded Mary, or Elizabeth I, the epitome of splendor. But there is another name that is often forgotten: Edward VI, a child who ascended the throne at the age of 9, a seemingly innocent boy who became one of the most tyrannical rulers in English history. The story you are about to hear is not a tragedy about a weak child who died young. It is a warning, a chilling testament to the fact that absolute power can corrupt, even in the hands of a child. And what happened in Edward's final days will make us look at the entire Tudor legacy with new eyes. The chain of events began with the birth of a monster. In 1537, after years of yearning for an heir, Henry VIII finally got his hands on what he had always dreamed of: a legitimate son. When Prince Edward was born, the nation erupted in joy over not just a child, but a symbol of stability that the Tudor dynasty had long awaited. But the joy was quickly overshadowed by a shadow of grief. Just 12 days later, the boy's mother, Jane Seymour, died of complications after giving birth. Her death not only left the child motherless, but also made him the most precious spiritual asset of an increasingly paranoid king. Edward grew up under the strict protection of guards, scholars, and courtiers who surrounded him as if he were the living embodiment of the nation's destiny. No friends, no fun, only duty and expectation. And it was that isolation that sooner or later sowed the seeds of the unexpected. In stark contrast to the rough fate of his two half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had experienced the coldness, humiliation, and instability of their own powerful father, Edward was placed in an almost sacred position from birth. He was not rejected. He did not live under the shadow of royal wrath. Edward was honored. He was worshipped. Like a late miracle, like an affirmation of God for the Tudor line. Perhaps because of the guilt that weighed on his heart after so many years of tormenting his daughters, Henry VIII placed on Edward all his hopes, all his dreams of saving the dynasty. But his love did not take the form of gentleness. It became control, wrapped in a beautiful garment: education. An education not for children, but for a god, purposely designed to temper a king with the mark of the Protestant Reformation. Edward was surrounded by the most brilliant scholars of the kingdom, but they did not come to teach mathematics or history. They came to mold the perfect Protestant leader. Each lesson was a delicate but profound needle that sewed a piece of thought into that young mind. John Check, chief among them, was not just a scholar. He was a believer in religious purification. Under him, Edward did not learn to live, he learned to rule. From the age of 6, Edward was taught that Catholicism was to be destroyed, and that his throne was not just a royal right, but a divine will. By the age of 8, he could eloquently argue about the unholiness of the Pope and justify the absolute power of the king. But while Edward's intellect grew, his heart withered in isolation. There were no friends, no games, no one to teach him the tenderness or sorrow of ordinary people. There were only adults, always bowing their heads. They taught him control, but not empathy. They let him reason, but cut off his emotions. And it was in the gilded cage of, in that wisdom, something was broken. Edward's future reign was not born of popular will or human experience. It was forged in the fires of solitude, from a child seen as the instrument of destiny. And it was that isolation that sowed the seeds of a rule that was both learned and unloving, a form of power that was cold and ruthless. Can a child really be so terrifying? In the autumn of 1547, the English throne fell to a boy of just 9 years old. Edward VI, the favored son of Henry VIII, inherited not only a dynasty but also a legacy fractured by religious hatred and the deep cuts of reform. Raised in an environment where whispers hailed him as the chosen one, Edward ascended the throne with an unshakable belief that his calling was divine. While Mary and Elizabeth struggled with the darkness of their father's anger, Edward was raised in a false light, a light lit by radical Protestant tutors who showed him the only path, the purification of faith by absolute power. But the danger lay not in the doctrine, but in the boy's belief that he was born to practice it. England was a religious minefield. Henry VIII had broken away from Rome, but the people were still divided between loyal Catholics, moderates, and radical reformers. The Regency Council, headed by the Duke of Somerset, attempted to chart a moderate political course. But Edward, a newcomer to the throne, quickly showed himself to be no pawn. From his first meetings, the boy king astonished the elders with his icy stubbornness. He interrupted, preached doctrine, and delivered stern judgments. Within weeks, Edward was personally approving death sentences for alleged heretics, discussing the reasons for execution as if he were dissecting a Latin lesson without a trace of hesitation or compassion. Notes from his early reign show the boy smiling as he signed death warrants, with a cold pride in finding proof in the Bible for each punishment. For Edward, each execution was not a tragedy but an academic triumph. When his advisors proposed religious concessions to keep the peace, Edward not only refused but also threw tantrums. Once, when a noble suggested allowing Catholic families to worship in secret, the boy king threw an inkwell at him and shouted that God would destroy England for such weakness. At first, these outbursts were attributed to childhood immaturity, but then people began to see more clearly. There was no room for mercy in Edward's soul. Not because he did not understand the truth, but because he believed that any forgiveness was a betrayal of God. Worse, Edward seemed to have no childish pleasures. While other children his age were absorbed in horseback riding, playing with wooden swords, or drawing their favorite animals, Edward was immersed in documents about the Spanish Inquisition, studying forms of torture and noting the effectiveness of each method like a cold scholar. In his private chambers, servants found drawings of torture devices next to them, handwritten by the king, commenting of the ability to break the will of heresy. It was no longer intelligence but a dangerous form of immersion. A boy with the soul of a dogmatist, the power of a king, and completely lacking the limits of compassion. What would happen if absolute power fell into the hands of a child? No one expected that, in the cold and whispering walls of the Tudor palace, a storm would form in the form of a boy. Edward VI, the diminutive heir of Henry VIII, was not simply a precocious child. He was the crystallization of an age obsessed with religious purification and power that was supposed to come from God. Surrounded by radical Protestant clergy and courtiers eager to control the throne, Edward absorbed the doctrine of divine kingship, not with childish curiosity, but with fanatical fervor. From the very first pages of his diary, Edward did not record games or longing for his mother, but instead meticulously described punishments, executions, and heretics burned alive. He observed, not to mourn, but to learn, as if the person before him were not a person, but the subject of an experiment. At age 10, while other children were learning to write, Edward composed his own militant sermons, calling for the eradication of Catholic influence, and declaring that anyone who dared to tolerate heresy would be punished, not only in the pulpit, but in the harem, Edward's small power revealed a more terrifying nature. A servant accidentally spilled wine on a royal document, a minor offense that would have been met with a reprimand. But under the boy king's direction, the servant was taken to the middle of the courtyard and made the target of a public humiliation. The food was spoiled, the laughter was sarcastic, and Edward's indifferent gaze was like a young god observing suffering not with regret, but to record his reactions like a psychosurgeon. That indifference, line by line, seeped into his diary. Edward wrote of death, pain, and fear with the same cold tone he reserved for describing the atmosphere aftermath. When a cook died after being flogged for reciting a Catholic prayer, the only thing Edward wrote was, "The method worked better than expected." But it wasn't just the writings that made historians shudder. It was the way Edward treated his own relatives. His sister Mary was a mere instrument of heresy to be controlled. His half-sister Elizabeth was valued only for her ability to serve Protestant purity. In Edward's eyes, blood was not as valuable as loyalty to the doctrine he worshipped. Edward turned every relationship into a political game, even his uncle Thomas Seymour. When Thomas tried to gain influence with gifts and kindness, Edward did not relent. On the contrary, he recognized the effort as a ploy, and when Thomas was tried for treason, Edward didn't just sign his name. He stood silently behind the window, watching the axe fall with eyes drained of emotion. There were no tears, just a short diary entry. This method of execution seems to have worked. As Edward grew older, he needed no one to represent him. By the age of 12, he had already begun to ignore his advisors and intervene directly in state affairs. His reforms were no longer encouragements, but edicts. Church attendance became a duty, enforced by a secret system of neighbors, acquaintances, and even children who were rewarded for reporting their parents for going astray. Edward not only dominated public faith, he invaded the most personal spaces of each person. He dictated how to pray, what people should believe, and even how they should think about God. To him, breaking the doctrine was not just a mistake, it was a betrayal, both to the throne and to heaven. The punishment, from public humiliation to slow death in front of crowds. And it was Edward who aggravated the sentences, believing that leniency would defile the purity of the faith. Ghosts are often thought to grow up on the battlefield or dungeon, but in this case, one of the darkest symbols of the Tudor dynasty was raised in a silken cradle. With his diary in hand and a heart seemingly no longer touched by compassion, Edward VI became living proof that the most terrible thing is that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it only smiles quietly in the form of a crowned child. In his short but haunting reign, Edward VI was not just a young king. He was the architect of a carefully programmed system of repression, where devotion to dogma was no longer optional, but the law. Under his rule, England became a spying nation, where citizens were encouraged to denounce their neighbors for even the slightest manifestation of Catholicism. More than a policy initiative, it was Edward's personal passion. He did not simply read reports. He pored over every line, summoned accusers to ask for details, and personally adjusted the punishments, often to increase the degree of pain or humiliation. The power that Edward reveled in was not the power to rule, but the power to judge the human soul. And in his young hands, that power became the instrument of a mind that was both too intelligent and too unsympathetic. While mature monarchs often left the handling of heresy to the clergy, Edward did the opposite. He demanded to see every case, recorded every theological error in detail, and inflicted punishments that, in his opinion, would correct the soul of the lost. Edward's personal notes from this period, the quiet and chilling pages of his diary, were like a manual of religious torture. Each heretic had his own punishment, weighed according to how dangerous it was to the truth he believed to be. And when ordinary punishments were not enough to purify someone, Edward devised public humiliations, carried out with ritual precision. A faithful Catholic priest was forced to wear the sign, "An Enemy of Christ," on his chest, trudging through the streets of London amid the screams and hail of children, all done exactly as the young king had ordered. Standing from his window, Edward watched without taking his eyes off, laughing as he dictated to his secretary each reaction crowd, like a scientist observing his experiments. But perhaps the darkest part of the boy king's heart lay not in the public punishments, but in the way he treated his own flesh and blood. For his half-sister Mary, a staunch Catholic and legitimate heir, Edward held back no familial feelings. In his eyes, she was not a sister but a traitor, a living challenge to the purity of the Protestant kingdom he was building. In private letters, Edward called Mary cold and hateful, bastard, antichrist. Not to threaten but to plan to remove her from the line of succession, plan to accuse her of heresy, and if necessary, plan to execute her. He did not stop at anger. He spent hours every day writing out scenarios in which Mary would be brought to trial, burned at the stake, completely removed from the Tudor bloodline, as if in this way, the soul of the nation would be saved. Even Edward's most radical advisors began to fear his obsession. They whispered about the king's cold, inhuman harshness and his complete lack of humane feeling. Whenever Mary's name was mentioned, Edward would darken, withdraw from others, and lock himself in his room to write long, passionate essays, not about economics, policy, or peace, but about the urgency of ridding the world of his sister in the name of the purity of the faith. This was no longer politics. This was a crusade led by a child with the mind of an adult, but a heart corrupted by dogma. And in the cold silence of the palace corridors, people began to whisper, perhaps it was not Edward who ruled England, but the obsession that possessed his soul. In the final stage of his life, Edward VI was not merely a sickly boy on the throne. He was a young man profoundly obsessed with doctrinal purity, to the point where the line between faith and hatred had almost completely disappeared. Royal archival documents reveal detailed scenarios drafted by Edward himself, the arrest, trial, and execution of his half-sister Mary. He didn't just fabricate charges of heresy and treason, he also wrote out a full confession he hoped to force Mary to recite, in which she would renounce Catholicism and admit to being illegitimate. If she complied, she would be granted the mercy of a beheading instead of being burned alive. These documents are not political strategy, they are manifestations of a young mind twisted by absolute power and religious extremism. Edward's hatred for Mary was not a tactic, it was a moral fever turned fanatical. His attitude toward Elizabeth was more complex, but equally cold-blooded. He did not see her as family, but as a useful pawn in the religious power game. Elizabeth's Protestant faith made her a viable option for securing sectarian alliances. Her marriage prospects were not rooted in personal affection, but rather designed to advance Edward's sweeping vision of religious reform. Even the positive emotions he may have felt for her were filtered through a lens of doctrine and strategy, revealing that, to Edward, people only existed in terms of their utility to his religious mission. This inability to form healthy familial relationships extended beyond the royal household. Within the court, Edward viewed nobles, advisors, and servants as interchangeable tools. Loyalty, in his eyes, meant absolute submission. Anyone who hesitated, objected, or showed compassion toward Catholics risked being dismissed or executed. By early 1553, as Edward's body began to collapse from illness, his mind did not weaken. Instead, it hardened and became more dangerous. The teenage king wasn't concerned with dying. He was obsessed with securing a Protestant future for England. The fear of Mary ascending the throne sent him spiraling into political mania. He secretly met with radical Protestant leaders and orchestrated a bold plot to bypass both of his sisters and place his devout cousin Jane Grey on the throne. This wasn't just a coup, it was a blueprint for an unprecedented theocracy. In his final weeks, Edward personally drafted lists of people to be executed, estates to be confiscated, and laws to be enacted for the pure kingdom he envisioned. His handwriting, trembling from illness, sprawled across pages filled with chilling detail. He was no longer the manipulated child. He was the mastermind behind the conspiracy. Edward's death was far from peaceful. The illness, possibly a combination of tuberculosis and arsenic poisoning from his royal physician's treatments, rotted his body day by day. His hair and nails fell out. His skin turned a mossy green. In feverish delirium, he shouted sermons about purging through blood, only to regain lucidity and continue issuing orders for religious purges. Witnesses recorded that even in his final moments, Edward did not seek forgiveness or reconciliation. Instead, he cursed Mary and begged God to protect England from the Catholic darkness. His last words were not farewells but a fanatical proclamation. And on the 6th of July, 1553, Edward died, leaving behind a stunned court and a kingdom teetering on the brink of civil war. Even his most loyal servants whispered that perhaps Edward's death was a deliverance not just for him, but for the entire nation. His legacy was not salvation, but a scar. What he hoped to build, a Protestant paradise, ultimately stood as evidence of religious terror. And in a bitter twist of fate, Edward's extremism led many English people, even Protestants, to welcome Mary as a savior. Today, historians no longer see Edward as merely a pawn. Preserved documents reveal a young but dangerous intellectual child, granted unlimited power and completely isolated from basic humanity. And in that toxic fusion of unchecked childhood and unyielding faith, Edward VI became one of history's most haunting warnings about the dark side of divine authority, left unrestrained. Edward VI's reign was short, but it left a deep mark on English political and religious history, not because of the religious reforms he instituted, but because of what it exposed. The dangers of a ruler armed with absolute power and an unshakable belief in his own truth, when he himself was not old enough to understand the consequences. Edward's case is a brutal example of how youth, cut off from reality and nurtured on extremist doctrine, can become the instrument of an ideology legitimized by royal power. Where mature tyrants may be bound by experience, political connections, or even fear of resistance, Edward was the embodiment of pure power, unconstrained by experience or mercy. Emotionally isolated and surrounded by fanatical teachers, he became a man ready to reason out the extermination of thousands of people, series which saw cruelty as the path to salvation. This was not a fall from grace, but a direct consequence of an education designed not to mature men, but to perpetuate ideologies. Edward was the perfect product of a regime that valued ideological loyalty over humanity. A boy with a sharp theological mind, but incapable of feeling the pain his decisions caused thousands of innocent subjects. Edward's death was seen by many as a deliverance for England. Documents show that he was not merely a victim of manipulation, but an active promoter of oppression and fanaticism. His reign was a dark testament to how absolute power combined with dogma can turn a child into a tyrant. Had he lived to adulthood, Edward could have become one of history's most terrible religious tyrants. But he died young, and perhaps it was England's final act of salvation.